Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Brand Fortress HQ and our Tactics Tuesday. We're excited to be back live again on LinkedIn. So if you're listening out there, this is one of the things that we've done in the past, and we're getting in the habit of doing is being live on LinkedIn. So if you have questions every Tuesday at about 2:15 Central Time, we're working on being live on LinkedIn. So that way we can answer those questions live as we talk about different topics. Today, what we're going to be talking about are the five deadly sins for brands on Amazon. And this is something that, off mic, we've been talking quite a bit about as far as, kind of those mistakes that both short term and long term that we've seen brands making that we're working with, and then also in our own brands and that type of stuff over the history of really growing both on and off Amazon. So, with that, I think the first one I want to start out with, because I think Matt and I have actually gone through quite a bit of pain with a couple of clients around this, is changing your brand name on Amazon. We've run into a couple of different situations where for various reasons people have needed to change their brand name, and I wanted to talk real quick about this because I think this is one of those things where it really pays off in order to get that brand name right up front, and talk today a little bit about why it's such a big deal and why it is so painful in order to change your brand name later on. So with that, actually, I'm going to hand it over to you, Matt, if you kind of walk through, kind of your perspective on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of different reasons that a seller would have to go and change their brand name after the fact. And I can think of a couple of reasons that I've helped brands with that were unavoidable. But there were some, and actually I was a self-created victim of one that caused lots of pain down the road. So the first one that I didn't really think through, and I think it was my either first or second brand, is I had an LLC name that it was a previous LLC that was tangentially relevant to the brand that we were launching on Amazon, but I just used the LLC name just for ease of use when creating the account, which caused a lot of problems later on. The other best practice that I didn't follow back then was that I was actually using my actual personal Amazon login when I created that account. So I used that same email address, which again caused all kinds of issues down the road. So, that it didn't make sense how having the LLC as my seller name on the listing, and it became a blinking red light that really annoyed me forever and ever. And that was the first time that I went through a brand changeover. So I think really the point of this being one of the deadly sins and alerting and putting it top of mind for people is when you create your seller account, think of it like what we teach our new students coming through the program is think with the end in mind. So even if your plan isn't to sell the business anytime soon, going through the process of setting things up like as if you were. And one of those is your brand name and making sure that it matches the LLC and bank account and all that kind of good stuff. And for us, it didn't. And like John said at the beginning, changing the brand name is such a painful process on Amazon. Walking through the process with the brand that we work with, and I don't know, it's about a 2.5 month long process. I mean, they do have a lot of SKUs, a lot of different variations. So I think that certainly adds to the complexity. But and the reason why that brand is changing the brand name is one of those unavoidable reasons. So it wasn't something that could have been thought of in the beginning, but it certainly highlights the complexity of what it looks like to change your brand name on Amazon. So yeah, that's the kind of recent experience that we've been dealing with here.
Yeah, and so a couple of things that I want to make sure that we cover here, because I think it's really important for our brands that are listening. So a couple of things to keep in mind here. The first one is that, again, not legal advice. That said, when we're looking at just the requirements for brand registry, is to either have a name trademark or an image mark. So in this case, or one of the cases with the brands that we worked with, they had told us like, hey, basically, their product is fairly popular off of Amazon, but nobody can find it on Amazon because they're not ranking for their brand name, and they're struggling for the brand name to be put into their title. And the reason was because they had opened their store, or they had registered under a different brand name because they didn't think they could get a trademark lawyer had told them like, hey, this is too similar to another brand name. What they didn't realize was they could actually use an image mark to at least meet the requirements for Amazon. Well, they kind of worked out with the lawyers as far as, what the trademark implications were there. And so solving that problem helped kind of realign their brand. But then, as Matt was talking about, having to change their SKUs from one brand to another essentially meant that we had to recreate those SKUs and lose a lot of the history that they had for selling over a couple of years on those SKUs. So that means losing your reviews, that means losing your sales momentum, that means losing your keyword rank. So especially if you've been on Amazon for a few years and you've built up, a pretty good sales volume with the products that you have, you're kind of stuck with either having to do something where you've got to choose between my brand name's not in my title, or I have to pick a different brand name that, is harder for people to find or may not even index for my own brand, which is not ideal, or essentially restarting with those listings on Amazon. And both of those options really suck, which is why this is one of the first things that I know that, it may not apply to 80% of the people that are listening, but for that 20% that are in that boat, like, really the faster you can make that switch, the better when you start looking at a long-term investment. And then for the other brands out there, if you're looking at launching another brand or you're looking at buying another brand, this is definitely one of the things that I would look into as far as making sure that that brand name is brand registered and you have that aligned with everything both on and off Amazon in order to get all the benefits that we talk about on the podcast all the time about, being a brand for long-term success.
Yeah, I mean, it's all, honestly, in a lot of ways, it's all about avoiding pain, right? There's a lot of other benefits to making sure that you flesh this out early on, but there's a lot of painful results if you don't. And I guess I would say definitely dial in on the trademark, making sure that you can effectively trademark the name and that you're not going to be in a position where that's problematic. Also, I think in that conversation, if what we're saying is make sure that you solidify that brand early on, and that you can get it trademarked and that you can get it brand registered and that you can, do all these things. Well, then the question becomes, well, okay, what do I need to pay attention to in order to actually decide what that brand name is going to be? How do I make that determination? And I don't know that there's one set answer for every company, like every product line. It's different. However, I would say this. I think it will help if you take a step back. Like if you already know, like there's a lot of things in play here, right? Like, do you already know what the product is that you're selling? Do you already know, like, do you have some of those things lined up? If you do, and I assume if you're watching this podcast, there's a decent chance you kind of already know what you might want to sell or you're already selling it. Then the question becomes, who is your ideal avatar? And then from there, and really nailing that down, right? Like not just I sell to men or not just I sell to people who hike or, like really, we've talked about this before, but making sure that you nail down the details of who that avatar is that you're going to sell to, and then use that to determine what that brand name should be, because it should be a brand name that's going to resonate with that customer. And I also believe that it should resonate in a way that taps into whatever your primary USP is going to be within your business. Like, what is your brand going to be about? And although, like, let's say you sell hiking gear, like you could do something that's hiking related, but you could also step back out of that a little bit. And I'll give you an example, like for our company, Pro Tough Products, not that that's like an amazing brand name, but I made that decision kind of early on with the thought that we might break out of the pool category at some point. Now, the reality is that we haven't. We've stayed in that pool category because it was where we were comfortable, and we're trying to kind of break out of that at this point. But the good news is, with that brand name, I can sell in pretty much any category I want. Pro Tough Products does not limit me in terms of what category. But what it does dial in on is the durability of the product, and because we offer this kind of unlimited, unconditional, lifetime replacement warranty, it all kind of ties together in that. And so the brand name makes sense. So just kind of look at it from that perspective. What do you want to be as a brand? Not just what are you going to sell, but what are you going to be? And then what aspect of that is going to resonate most with your customer avatar, and lean into that as you decide on a brand name. Also, these days, don't be afraid to use ChatGPT, because it is really helpful in this kind of an area where you're trying to be creative about something, but there's certain aspects you want to be consistent with. It can be really helpful in that, in giving you some ideas as to what direction to go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think transitioning into our second deadly sin that I want to make sure that we cover here, which is mismanaging reviews. So I think a part of this that, kind of I see a lot and I think is really misunderstood by seller or by, brands on Amazon is how important it is. Yes, we all want 5-star reviews, but actually it's, 10 times more important to look at how you can prevent 1-star reviews. And a lot of that boils down to, really seeing your product and your brand from your customer's perspective and eliminating any of those roadblocks that they have around using your product in order to get the result that they want. And so, if you sell enough on Amazon, you're going to get 1-star reviews. It's just going to happen. That said, I think rather than, because I've talked to, we've had a number of clients where they get a 1-star review and they're angry and upset. And I can understand that initial response. And in some of them, like, it just sucks. Like the feedback that they give is not accurate. That said, I have seen some of those where, like, if you take a half step back, the customer has at least a semi-legitimate point. And in those cases, what I would strongly encourage people to do is, sometimes it's a product issue and sometimes it's a messaging issue, and see what you can do in order to, make either your messaging or your product better based on those negative reviews. And then also just communicating with customers and do anything you can within terms of service in order to prevent those 1-star reviews. Because especially, I think what a lot of brands don't realize now is that Amazon no longer has a straight formula for how they calculate ratings for products. Those 1-star reviews actually, from at least what I've seen, is that they actually weight more on pulling down a product's rating than 5-star reviews. So it's not a straight, hey, if you have 100 reviews and, X number of percent are 5-star and Y percent are 1-star, that whatever that, mathematically works out to, that's the rating Amazon gives you. Doesn't work like that anymore. Amazon kind of puts their thumb on the scale. And at least from what I've seen anecdotally is that, they tend to give more weight to negative reviews than they do to positive reviews.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair assessment. That seems to be my also anecdotal evidence would suggest that. One of the things that I think is important to point out is to kind of take a step back from that and to really dial in on, yes, it's negative reviews are definitely more disadvantageous to your brand than 5-star reviews are advantageous. So it is one obvious reason to focus in on dealing with those negative reviews. And I agree with you, John, that one of the best ways to do that is to really think through the entire process, your entire sales process, and also your post-purchase process, which hopefully you have, from start to finish. So in other words, like your images and your title and your listing, your A+ content, like your FAQs within your A+ content, the information that you're feeding Rufus about your product so that people are receiving that information on the front end when they're asking questions about the product, to head off those 1-star reviews and give customers the information that they need to make an informed decision. First of all, whether your product is the right product to buy, because a lot of times you end up with a 1-star review because the customer bought your product thinking it was one thing, when in reality it's something not quite that, and then they're upset because they feel like they were deceived, when in reality maybe they just didn't read it quite close enough or whatever. But if you had been more conscious about making that statement known early on, maybe you could have avoided that. Making sure in your product packaging that you've got the information that needs to be there, and also that customers actually see it and interact with it. Just because you got an instructional pamphlet in your product does not mean that the customer actually engages with that instructional pamphlet or even notices that it's there. So, don't assume that you've checked the box because you put instructions in there. Make sure that you've done it in such a way that it's nearly impossible for the customer to interact with the product without interacting with the instructions. But backing up from that, I also want to point out, and this is a very psychological thing, but just to pay attention to, and that is, just because Amazon now lists, like, it is good that they do this, but it still isn't the whole thing. Like it used to be, you had the star rating visual, but until you actually clicked in to see the reviews, you couldn't see like it was 4.7 or 4.3 or whatever. Like you wouldn't know that. Now Amazon does show that, at least in some categories. I think maybe it's all categories now, but they actually do list that on even in the search results, it'll say 4.7 versus 4.8 or something, which helps. But still that visual is there. And if you're at a 4.8, so you got a 5-star visual and you get one negative review, you could easily move to a 4.7, which now has you at a 4.5 visual. That's very different, especially if you're in a category where many products are sitting in that 4.5 visual, right? If you also are a 4.5 visual, then you don't look any better than them. even if technically, because they could have a 4.3 and be a 4.5 star visual, and you're a 4.7 and have a 4.5 star visual. Well, there's a big difference between those two products, but visually, customers don't see that necessarily. So really paying attention to those negative reviews and just how big that differential can be is very important. So don't ignore, that. But on the flip side of that, as much as you need to deal with those negative reviews, I also think that in your post-purchase process, doing everything that you can to take advantage of opportunities to encourage your customers to actually give you 5-star reviews is, I think, also critical. Also, take advantage of opportunities to where, psychologically you can create advantages that encourage your customers to decide to leave you that 5-star review, even if you don't ask for it, right? Like when you do things that they don't expect you to do, like that you wow them with, right? When you correct mistakes that they didn't even know that you made. I don't know if anybody's seen these videos, but where the husband walks around the house and like unscrews light bulbs and disconnects things. And then the wife comes around, she's like, hey, I need this fixed. And the husband walks in and like 2 seconds later, he's got it fixed, right? So there are ways that you can kind of build that into your process where there are mistakes that happen that you get to correct that maybe the customer didn't even notice was a mistake, but you get to send them an email and say, hey, by the way, we missed this thing. Don't ignore opportunities like that where you can create good feelings in your customers, that will result in those 5-star reviews because they are important. You're muted.
Matt.
I realized that right out of the gate. One of the things that you mentioned, John, was that you're going to get 5-star reviews, and or 1-star reviews, and I definitely sympathize with the pain that the brand owners that we're currently working with. Every time a 1-star review, whether or not it's useful or even warranted, they hurt. But every one of them is an opportunity. And for an example, I have one of the products that I sold it was a meat injector that was much better than the meat injectors that are currently on the market. But I kept getting 1-star reviews and I couldn't figure out what it was. But because we had an audience, because I could actually talk to people, it was actually because they were putting it together incorrectly after cleaning it. It wasn't an issue with the product, although the negative reviews came through as the product is crap. I had used it once and I had to throw it away. But it was actually, they didn't know how to put it back together properly after they cleaned it. So it actually became our secondary image. It became the reason why we had a QR code on the packaging to kind of walk them through in a video. So not only did we figure out a way to reverse or go around, get them before they received a 1-star or they received a 1-star experience by letting them know how to do it, but it also increased our opt-in rate because they saw like, oh, now I have to watch this video in order to see how to do it correctly. So it made more people interested in scanning the QR code so that they could watch that video. But not only did it halt 1-star reviews, but I think it helped our 5-star review profile too, just getting it out in front of them with the answers to questions that they didn't even know that they should have yet. So I think paying attention to the 1-star reviews, no matter how ridiculous you think that they are, and figuring out creative solutions to minimize them out of the gate before they happen. And in our case, it was a secondary image and a QR code with the video that had other effects besides just skirting around 1-star reviews.
Yeah, and I want to make sure that we touch on something that, we talked about before we hit record here, which is, and I think, kind of finding that, that Goldilocks zone, if you will, of on one hand, you want to make sure that you're following Amazon's terms of service, especially when it comes around, to incentivizing reviews. And that really means that Amazon doesn't allow incentivizing reviews anymore. So, that's something that you want to pay attention to. But on the other end, and Mike, I know you brought this up, is that making sure that you have a process in place that works for your brand of, reaching out and asking for reviews. And there's, it can be something as simple as Amazon now has a built-in to where after, a certain number of days, and I think Helium 10, and I'm sure there's a bunch of other plugins that do this as well, where you literally can push a button and it sends out, a review request to somebody and it just shows them 1 through 5 stars. And then they click on it and then it takes them over to Amazon, for their order, and then they can write, what that review looks like. And correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I still think Amazon also allows either that or you to send out kind of, customer message around reviews. And of course there's, rules around what you can say in that message and that type of stuff that I don't think we need to dive deep into for this particular episode, but just to have, some sort of system in place that you're using on a regular basis to ask for those reviews. Because, even when you're asking reviews, I think the average review rate is somewhere between 1% to 2%. And I imagine it's a lot less if you don't have any sort of system in place in order to ask for reviews.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the biggest thing is just if you're not asking, you're not getting. Like people are not going to leave a review if you don't ask. The vast majority of people are only leaving a review because they had a negative experience. If you want the people who had a positive experience to leave a review, then you need to ask. But also, just going back to that point, don't expect a 5-star review if you didn't give them a 5-star experience, right? A 4-star experience probably isn't going to generate any review at all. Like, yeah, you'll get some, but it's that 5-star experience that really gives that, it puts it over the top. And that's, I think, the thing, make it over the top, make sure that the experience is way better than they expected it to be. And then don't forget to ask, because too many sellers, remember that asking is not the same as incentivizing. Those two things are different. And if you're too afraid to ask because you're afraid Amazon's going to see that you think that you're incentivizing, then you are not going to get those reviews and you're never going to get the sales that you want to get. And so being too afraid of Amazon is going to hurt your sales. And there's a lot of categories in which that's true. You can't be so timid and so afraid that you don't implement some of the things that are truly just good business, and good brand building.
Yeah. So I do want to move on to our third deadly sin here, which is, I think, very timely for, everything that's happening right now with tariffs and all that type of stuff, but also really applies, I think, for a lot of brands, when they hit, their high season, which is going out of stock. So and this one it always kind of surprises me that I feel like this is one that, whether it's because of manufacturers or a variety of issues, that I see more than I would anticipate that I would see. And just to see, understand how painful this is. I mean, we were just on an office hours with a newer seller that we were helping out. And I mean, his account looks like a ski slope because, he had good inventory and he was using ads and optimized his listing and doing all those things right. And, sales were all moving in the right direction where, he doubled and tripled sales in a couple of months. And then he wasn't paying attention to his stock. And all of a sudden, his product is, close to out of stock. So then he pauses ads for, 3-4 weeks because he's like, well, and it doesn't make sense to advertise. So that way I can go out of stock faster, which there's a whole discussion about, what should you do if you're going to go out of stock that I think we'll probably have to save for another episode. But just how painful that is. And, and I would also say, there's long-term damage that can be done from that too. And just how much time and money and effort it takes to get back to where you were from a momentum standpoint, because at the end of the day, Amazon is very much a momentum platform. And we start looking at that sales velocity, it can be very expensive, if not impossible, to get back to that sales velocity where you were before. Mike, I know you've had some experience with this as well.
Yeah, way too much, quite frankly, over the last 10 years. And, every season we think that we've kind of got it nailed. And then there's some new thing, COVID or, it's just been very strange. But the one thing that I can say is that, if there is one thing in our business that has hampered us the most, it's probably out of stocks, quite frankly. Now, it's definitely harder for a seasonal item, especially if you're a seasonal item and a brand that is on an upward trajectory, right, as overall, but you're seeing these kind of seasonal transitions. Forecasting can be really tough, and so that's one thing. So if you have a seasonal product, just know, look, even experienced sellers have trouble with forecasting that. So, but I would say that one of the things that I guess I'm learning, as much as it hurts to have extra inventory that you're paying for storage on, but you can't sell yet, there is a line that you should cross, let's say, in having that extra inventory at warehouses that are not Amazon, because Amazon's going to charge you a fortune to store that inventory, even just on a daily basis. But absolutely, if you go over and you get long-term storage fees or things like that. So too much inventory at Amazon's a problem. But if you don't have some sort of a staging warehouse someplace, then that's problematic, because then you don't have a way to address those issues when products start selling faster than you expected or whatever, and you don't have any backup. It's got to come from China. Because if it's coming from China, well, even if it's coming from a U.S. manufacturer, but let's face it, most of us, even with the tariffs, we're still going to be shipping from China for a while. So if you're coming from China, you've got production time, maybe even lead time before production time Then once the production time is finished, then you got to wait for a ship. Then you got to get on the ship. Then you got at least 2 weeks to get over to the US. You got to get through the port. You might have 2, 3, 4 weeks to get into Amazon because sometimes it's not that fast. So just imagine how much time, how much leeway you've got there that you could be out of stock for. You need to have that extra inventory in the States. And I guess that's where I would come back to the thing that I've always said. And it's probably the only thing that has kept our business afloat as a result of the mistake that happened for us with the agency that we hired, and they messed up our inventory, and then the tariffs hit, and so it just became this massive snowball. We would for sure be out of business if our margins weren't relatively good. Now, our margins aren't nearly as good as they used to be, with Chinese sellers coming in and Amazon ads fees going up and all that sort of thing, but they're still decent. And so that's the only thing that kept us, in a position where we're going to be able to weather this storm. But if you keep your margins high enough, you have room to store extra inventory to be ready. Like if you have a product that's selling well and you know that it's going well, and there's no reason to assume that as long as you keep doing the things the right way, that your sales aren't going to continue on that trajectory, then make sure you've got inventory ahead. I would say make sure you have at least 90 days of inventory in the States. You may not keep 90 days at Amazon, but I would keep 90 days of inventory in the States, maybe even a little more than that. So you've got some extra leeway there to where when you order more product, you've got time before it gets there and gets into Amazon.
Yeah, and I think that segues really well into, knowing your numbers. I know that's one thing that we talked about in kind of the fourth kind of deadly mistake that we see brands see. Matt, I'm really curious, from your perspective, what are a couple of the biggest numbers that you feel like Amazon sellers should know on a regular basis?
Well, one of them, I think that is a sneaky one if you're not paying a lot of attention to are Amazon fees. I think there's a lot of ways. I mean, I have another example of a product that we did an analysis on, and we're able to reduce fees by a couple of dollars just by folding the product and putting it into a vacuum sealed bag. So I think paying attention to the tier that you're in, the size tier that you're in, and constantly keeping up to date on that. It was actually an Amazon remeasurement that increased our fees, and it was the way that they remeasured that was the reason for the increased fees. So I think paying attention to your Amazon fees is one of them that can be sneaky, but also just it's surprising to me as we talk to new brand owners and even seasoned brand owners that don't really understand the profitability on Amazon. It's easy to calculate your ACoS and it's easy to calculate fees once they're set in stone, but there's so many other fees involved that I think that most Amazon brand owners don't take into account, or at least aren't looking at them on a regular basis. As we went through the process with tariffs and that kind of stuff, I think one of the things that I marked down on my task list to do on a more regular basis was have conversations with our manufacturers, and whether it be, can we get better terms, or, we found another manufacturer as we were trying to find a backup that had a little bit better pricing. I think constantly looking at and optimizing your supply chain and asking manufacturers. I mean, a lot of sellers that we talk to haven't negotiated with their manufacturers since they found them on Alibaba 2.5 years ago. And there's just a lot of money that's being left on the table. But I think overall, really understanding all of the fees that go into selling on Amazon, the new inbound placement fees and things like that happen all the time. I mean, Amazon's changing things so frequently that paying attention to your numbers on a very regular basis, like, most other types of businesses, every 6 months or once a year. But I think on Amazon, I think it's important to be calculating your contribution margin and your profitability on even a monthly basis to make sure that things are in line. It's just, you have to pay attention to them more frequently because of how frequently Amazon changes, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, is that the Amazon business is very different in that regard, because you are at Amazon's mercy on a lot of fronts, on your advertising, on the fulfillment fees, storage fees, placement fees, all of those various areas where Amazon is making, money. In fact, I was calculating it today, and it didn't occur to me previously, which amazes me, but I'm pretty sure Amazon's making more money per sale than I'm making per sale. So that was actually a little bit demoralizing, but you need to know the numbers. Like, for instance, I know before we started the call, the one that John, you were mentioning was your COGS, and keeping tabs on that, because obviously tariffs come into play. That's part of your COGS, landed COGS. What are the fees, of sea containers? Because, running a 40-foot container, even just in a normal year, those numbers can run from $2,500 for a 40-foot up to $5,000 or $6,000 for a 40-foot, depending on what time of year you're trying to ship. And that obviously is part of your landed COGS. And for some products, the freight might be one of the largest expenses. Maybe the product itself is fairly inexpensive to produce, but maybe it's large in volume, say, so it takes up a lot of space in a container on a per unit basis. And so in that case, your international shipping costs and maybe even your domestic inbound shipping costs can be one of the larger expenses. So if you're not paying attention to the fluctuations in that, if you calculated your costs in, say, January, and then you don't even look at those again until June, there's a good chance that those costs are way different now than they were in January. And if you're not accounting for that, you could technically be selling your product at a loss and not even know it. Especially if your margins are tight. And in some markets, it's hard to have, a wide margin. So just really knowing those numbers and calculating them regularly, actually taking the time to better understand what those numbers are and how they should be calculated. I think it's not uncommon for sellers to have a misunderstanding about what an actual, say what your COGS is. Like they'd be like, oh yeah, well, my manufacturing cost, right? Well, yeah, but you still got to pay to get it here, and you got to pay the tariff, and you got to pay domestic, to get it in, and maybe you got to pay inbound placement fees to get it into Amazon, and all of those things add up to where maybe you got a $3 item, but by the time you get it to Amazon, it's a $5 item. Make sure you're paying attention to those numbers, and then also I think it's important to recognize that there's kind of good benchmarks for CM1, CM3 to get an idea for how healthy your business is. Like Matt mentioned early on in this conversation that you should really be, even if you're not thinking about an exit right, within the next year or two, right? You should be building your business in such a way that if that opportunity arises, you're ready for it, right? Or if at some point you decide that it's time, you're ready for it. And one of those things is, the health of your business. And anybody who's purchasing your business, they're not just going to be looking at EBITDA. Like they're going to pay attention to what's your CM1, what's your CM2, what's your CM3, are you hitting the targets that you probably should be hitting, in terms of benchmarks. So if you don't know what those are, what those contribution margins are, first look up the definition of those and what expenses are calculated in each one of those. And then kind of ask, ChatGPT or something like, okay, what are some good benchmark numbers that I should be shooting for? Because one of the things that it does for you is it gives you a better target for where to start trying to save money. Because if your CM1 looks good, but your CM2 looks bad, well, then your CM3 is probably going to look bad too. But if the only thing you look at it is that end, CM3 number, you might think, well, I got to rein in my ad spend because that's where that's calculated is in your CM3. But maybe it's actually CM2 that's the problem, and you've got room to move there, but you don't even know it because you're not looking at that number. So just be careful that you understand at each level of your business, what those numbers are and how you're comparing against good benchmarks.
Well, and I think that's a good reason why this also you need to take some time to look at it at a SKU level as well, and think about. So this is something that we like to think about, especially for brands that have a number of SKUs. Is looking at what is the mission of that product. Some products are essentially what we call tripwire products or entry-level products where it's just, it's something that gets somebody in the brand. And I think probably the easiest example I can use this is, one of our clients has a 1-pack, a 3-pack, and a 10-pack of, these, decorative post caps that they use for decks. Well, okay, somebody, obviously they get a lot more clicks and, a lot more sales on a 1-pack because the price is a lot lower. But usually somebody comes in, they're not going to, it's pretty rare that somebody's like, oh, I just need one of these. They usually need, somewhere between 5 to 15 of them. And so, if you start looking at that kind of tripwire product, you may break even on that tripwire product. But then when you start looking at, hey, I'm making really good margins on my 10-pack, because I have it optimized, that bigger size for a much higher profit margin, then, you really have to look at what's the mission of each one of those products and advertise accordingly. Because we might look at, success for that tripwire product of being break even, whereas, for your more expensive products where you really want to drive margin with them, you may want to see, 20, 30, 40% margin on that product, and you're very selective about what that ad strategy would look like. So I think that's why it's really important to know your numbers, not only from, a big picture company wise, but then also looking at that even at the SKU level to say, what is the mission of this SKU in my business? And sometimes that also means you look at it and say, either the SKU is not doing its job or it's upside down, and it might be time for us to retire that SKU.
Or it might be time to just change the mission of the SKU. But I think that's a really important point, though, is recognizing what is the mission of the SKU. I think it's easy, especially for sellers early on, to assume that the mission, and I did that, I like just being honest, I did that for a long time, not really recognizing that each product in my line had a different mission and could have a different mission other than it should have a big profit, and if it doesn't have a big profit, well, then maybe I need to stop selling it. Well, not necessarily. Maybe it just needs a different mission, and maybe it would really perform extremely well, as a loss leader kind of a product or a tripwire product. It's not performing well as a profitability, driver, but it may serve another purpose, and maybe you can repurpose it in that way.
Yeah. So moving on to our last of the 5 kind of deadly mistakes on Amazon is not having an after purchase program. And I think this is one that we've talked about quite a bit. In fact, we even put effort into, and we built a free course that we offer for this because we think it's so important when you look at, yes, there's a lot of things that I like about Amazon in the sense of, I think if you're, under $10 million a year in revenue as a brand, I think Amazon is still a great place to be in the sense of over half the e-commerce transactions happen there. When you look at, Amazon 10 to 20% conversion rates are very, common and possible. Whereas if you look at a website, they might be 1 to 2%. And so there's a lot of traffic, and Amazon has done a lot of good things in order to, obviously make those transactions as easy as possible. And to help brands at the same time, we've talked about a little bit already in this episode. And I think, just overall part of our mission of Brand Fortress is, yes, Amazon is a great place for growth. It still is in 2025. That said, you never want to have all your eggs in one basket. And at the end of the day, you want to be the person that has control over your brand. And that really means, having a way to contact your customers outside of Amazon if they decide to shut down your account for, any reason in the future. So, that's the one that I think is really important that I know we've all kind of talked offline about. Anything else that, Matt, that you want to add to that?
We just got off a phone call just a couple of days ago with a very high-level seller, very successful. He's in a high-level mastermind with me. He has a product that is consumable and people repurchase on a regular basis. And we offered him a partnership to where we would offer his product to the audience of a different brand. And then at the end of it, give him the emails from the partnership. Every email that opted in and got his product for free, we would give him the email address. And I was so surprised to hear that he didn't even really have any sort of post-purchase program for his products. I mean, his brand is the exact type of brand that you would want this type of an audience for in order to leverage. It's one that people have to go back and repurchase, and it's the type of brand and the type of category that people want to be loyal to a brand. And he didn't have any sort of process in place, and it was very surprising, and it re-solidified in my mind how important of a topic this is. Even though in this podcast, we harp on it over and over again, there are still a lot of sellers out there who aren't putting an effort into it. And it really doesn't require that much work. It does require some upfront work, but the benefits, I mean, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse when we talk about the benefits of having this audience, but we just experienced a guy who needs one desperately, who is experienced enough of a seller to know that he needs one, but didn't really have anything in place.
Well, and I think, again, a lot of it comes back to, there's very much a fear factor around that. A lot of sellers are afraid of what Amazon might do if they have some sort of post-purchase process. Are they going to find out about it? Are they going to not like it? And in fairness, if you're a fairly large brand that's making some really good money on Amazon, then you have a lot to lose, right? I mean, if Amazon decides that they don't like your post-purchase. I think the key there, though, is what you should be more afraid of is the possibility that Amazon finds something else in your business that they don't like, or some competitor files some claim against you that may be completely bogus, but all of a sudden turns your account off at the drop of a hat. And we have all heard horror stories of companies that were, 5, 10, $20 million plus companies that got shut down overnight. And it took months for them to reopen that account and get it running again. What do you do in that situation if you don't have a post-purchase process and you don't have a list? I said this in a previous conversation on the podcast, but I'll reiterate it. And that is, when this mistake happened with this agency over our inventory and the tariff thing came in, and I was looking at our numbers and realizing there was a very real possibility, and I'll be frank, that possibility hasn't completely been resolved. It's still possible this goes sideways, but I think we're in a much better position. But I was really nervous that our brand might fold, that we might go bankrupt. But here's the thing. I have 45,000 people on an email list that trust me, and I can email them anytime I want and sell them anything I want reasonably. And if they can use it, they would buy it because they trust me. So I could literally start a new brand overnight. And it wouldn't take a massive amount of capital because I already have an audience to sell to. Now, maybe I'm not going to immediately build a business that is the same size as what I have now, in the same volume of sale, but it would certainly be enough that I can make a good living on it. And that honestly gave me a lot of comfort knowing that, okay, yeah, this thing could go belly up, but I have the skills that I have, and I also have this list that I could go back to, and I know they would buy from me. So there's just a lot of comfort in that. And if you don't have that, I'm telling you, man, you're in a space where the waters are rough, and you might not even know it.
Yeah. Well, and I think, for listeners out there, kind of these 5, deadly sins, just going through them again on Amazon is, changing your brand name and all the pain that's involved in that, mismanaging reviews, going out of stock, not knowing your numbers, and then not having an after purchase program. The nice thing, and I'll put a shameless plug in here, is that we offer an after purchase program completely for free. So if you don't have one and you're like, hey, I don't know how to start one, we really run through everything from how to create that offer without violating Amazon's terms of service to how do I start building that email list. And, I think a lot of brands when they start out, you may only get, 5% of your customers to opt into your email list, but that's infinitely better than, what you have if you don't have an after purchase program, which is 0. So I would just, really encourage listeners out there, whether you're using our free course or you find something else, out there, that this is one of the ones that I feel like a lot of brands have slept on for way too long. And I really would encourage you, out of these 5 things, if, one in particular speaks to you, that's probably the biggest one that I would encourage listeners to take action on. All right. Well, guys, fantastic episode. And thank you, everybody, for listening. And we'll see you next time.